The silence in the room was the kind that felt heavy, pressing down on everyone's ears. It wasn't a peaceful silence. It was the kind you find in a hospital corridor or a library right before closing time. The air conditioning unit hummed in the corner, a low, steady drone that seemed to vibrate in the bones of the people sitting there. David sat at the long, polished table on the right side of the room. He was a man who was used to noise. His life was a constant stream of pinging phones, shouting stock traders, and the roar of private jet engines. He was a tech billionaire, a man who had built an empire on connecting people through screens and wires. But here, in this sterile room, there was nothing but that low hum. It made him feel itchy. He tapped his expensive pen against the surface of the table. Asterisk tap, tap, tap asterisk, until the young lawyer next to him gave him a nervous look. David stopped, but he didn't relax. He looked across the aisle. That was where the other man sat. Keanu Reeves didn't look like he belonged in a courtroom. He didn't look like he belonged in a fight. He was wearing a simple dark suit, the kind you could buy at a department store, not a tailor-made Italian import that cost more than a car. His shirt collar was open just a fraction at the top. His hair was messy, but in a way that looked intentional and careless at the same time. He sat with his back straight, but his shoulders were relaxed. He wasn't checking his watch. He wasn't looking at his phone. He was just sitting there, his hands resting on his knees, looking around the room as if he was trying to appreciate the architecture. David felt a spike of irritation. This was a serious legal battle. It was about intellectual property. It was about millions of dollars and the future of safety technology. How could this actor just sit there so calmly? It felt disrespectful. Or maybe, David thought, it was just arrogance. The lawsuit was complicated. David's company had developed a new stabilizing system for motorcycles. It was smart, precise, and expensive. Keanu's foundation had been working on something similar, a device that could keep a bike upright during a skid to prevent crushing the rider's legs. David's lawyers claimed the foundation had stolen the code. Keanu's team said they had come up with it independently after years of research and painful experience. To David, it was simple math. He owned the patent. He owned the rights. If someone else used it, they owed him money. That was how the world worked. You invent, you protect, you profit. It was a cycle of innovation. But looking at Keanu, David felt a crack in his certainty. Keanu wasn't looking at the papers in front of him. He was looking at the empty jury box. His expression was soft, almost sad. It made David uncomfortable. He was used to people looking at him with hunger or fear or respect. He wasn't used to this kind of quiet, unbothered observation. The sun was shining brightly through the large, rectangular windows that lined one-walled courtroom. The light was harsh, illuminating the dust motes dancing in the air. It made the room feel too exposed. Outside, the city was moving. Cars were honking. People were rushing to lunch. The world was spinning at 1,000,000 miles an hour. Inside, time felt stuck. David's lead lawyer, a sharp woman named Victoria, leaned in close. Her voice was a whisper, designed not to carry to the other side. "Mr. Sterling, we need to go over the opening statement one more time. The judge is strict on time limits." David nodded, but his eyes were still on Keanu. "I know the statement, Victoria. I wrote it. It's just, he looks very calm," Victoria said, adjusting her glasses. "Usually, defendants are sweating by now. We need to be ready for him to play the victim card. He's going to try to make the jury feel sorry for him because he's a celebrity being sued by a big, bad corporation." David finally looked away. "He is a celebrity, Victoria. That's the problem. The jury will love him. They've seen him save the world in movies. They think he's a hero. We need to remind them that in the real world, heroes still have to pay for the technology they use." Victoria nodded and went back to shuffling her papers. The sound of paper shuffling was loud in the quiet room. David took a deep breath. He tried to remember why he was so angry about this. It wasn't really about the money. He had plenty of money. It was about the principle. He had spent years building his company from a garage startup into a giant. He had sacrificed sleep, friendships, and his health. He had bled for this company. To see someone, anyone, even a movie star, just come along and use his life's work without permission felt like a theft of his soul. He watched as Keanu's lawyer, a smaller man with kind eyes, leaned over and whispered something to the actor. Keanu nodded. He didn't smile. He just looked down at his hands. For a second, David wondered what Keanu was thinking. Was he worried about his career? Was he worried about the money? Or was he thinking about something else entirely? David knew Keanu's history. Everyone did. The man had suffered terrible losses in his life. He had lost the person he loved more than anyone. He had faced tragedy that money couldn't fix. David looked at his own hands. They were smooth, soft from a life of indoor work and luxury. He had never gone hungry. He had never truly lost anything that couldn't be replaced. Suddenly, his anger felt a little hollow, but he pushed the feeling down. He couldn't think like that. He was here to win. That was what he did. He won. The bailiff, a tall man with a stoic face, walked over to the door that led to the judge's chambers. He didn't touch a handle. He simply waited for the signal light to turn green. All rise. The bailiff said a moment later. The sound of chairs scraping against the floor filled the room. David stood up, smoothing out the front of his jacket. He felt a rush of adrenaline. This was his stage. He might not be an actor, but he knew how to perform in a boardroom. He knew how to command a room. The judge entered. She was an older woman with gray hair pulled back into a tight bun. She moved efficiently, taking her seat behind the high desk. She didn't look at anyone. She just started arranging her papers. Case number 459B, the judge said, her voice clipped and professional. Sterling Tech versus the Arch Foundation. We are here for the opening arguments. Is the plaintiff ready? Victoria stood up instantly. Ready, Your Honor. And the defense? The judge looked over her glasses at Keanu's table. Keanu stood up slowly. He buttoned his jacket. Ready, Your Honor. His voice was low, steady. There was no tremble in it. David watched him closely. He expected to see a flicker of fear, a sign that Keanu knew he was outmatched. But there was nothing. Keanu looked back at the judge with a look of calm respect. It was maddening. The judge nodded. Very well. Ms. Victoria, you may proceed. Victoria stepped forward. She cleared her throat. The silence of the room seemed to deepen, waiting for her to break it. David felt his heart rate speed up. This was it. The beginning of the end for Foundation. He was sure of it. But as Victoria began to speak, weaving a tale of stolen data and corporate espionage, David found his eyes drifting back to Keanu. The actor wasn't looking at Victoria. He wasn't looking at the judge. He was looking out the window at the bright, clear day. A small fly was buzzing against the glass, trying to get out. Keanu watched it with gentle intensity, as if he was willing the fly to find a gap in the seal. It was such a small, human thing to do. In the middle of a high-stakes lawsuit, worth millions, he was watching a fly. David felt that strange tightness in his chest again. He looked away, staring at the pattern on the carpet. He told himself he didn't care. He told himself he was just a businessman doing his job. But as the hum of the air conditioning continued, filling the gaps between Victoria's sharp words, David had a sinking feeling that this wasn't going to be the easy victory he had imagined. He felt like he was standing on the edge of a cliff, and the ground beneath him was made of something much softer than rock. The proceedings dragged on. The minutes felt like hours. David's legs started to bounce again. He wanted to be out of there. He wanted to be in his office, where things made sense. Here, in the bright, sterile light, things were too clear. He could see the lines on the judge's face. He could see the dust on the windowsill. He could see the exhaustion in the eyes of the court reporter. It was all too real. And across from him, the man who starred an action movie sat perfectly still, looking like the only person in the room who wasn't afraid. The large screen on the wall glowed with a sharp blue light. It was filled with bar charts and line graphs that climbed high into the air, looking like jagged mountains. Victoria stood next to it, holding a long metal pointer. She tapped the screen gently, making a clicking sound that echoed through the quiet room. As you can see, Your Honor and members of the jury, Victoria said. Her voice was clear and loud, like a news broadcaster. The code in question is proprietary. It belongs to Sterling Tech. It represents millions of dollars in research and development. It is not just a bunch of numbers. It is an asset. David watched the jury. He saw a few of them nodding their heads. They were looking at the colorful charts. It looked impressive. It looked like the truth. To David, it was beautiful. It was a language of business. It was a language of the world he had built, a world where things had value, and owners had rights. Victoria pressed a button, and the image changed. Now there was a timeline. The Defendants Foundation released their prototype 3 months after our patent was filed. The timing is not a coincidence. The math is the math. You cannot have two identical complex algorithms appear out of thin air at the same time without one coming from the other. She paced back and forth, her heels clicking on the floor. She was in her element. She was painting a picture of theft. She made Keanu's foundation sound like a group of pirates who had sneaked into David's vault in the middle of the night and stolen the gold. David felt a swell of satisfaction. This was how you won. You didn't tell stories about feelings. You showed the data. You showed the facts. You proved that a line had been crossed. Victoria finished her presentation and turned back to the judge. The plaintiff rests on the opening statement. Your Honor, we believe the evidence is clear. The judge looked over at the other table. Very well. The defense may proceed. David leaned back in his chair. He adjusted his cufflinks. He expected a lawyer to stand up. He expected more charts. He expected a boring argument about how they didn't copy the code, or maybe a claim that they bought it legally. That was how the game was played. Lawyer versus lawyer. But nobody stood up. Keanu's lawyer, a quiet man with thinning gray hair, simply stayed in his seat. He nodded to his client. Then Keanu stood up. He didn't grab a stack of papers. He didn't walk over to a projector. He just buttoned his jacket and walked to the center of the room. He stopped in front of the jury box. He didn't stand behind a podium. He stood in the open, exposed. Good morning, Keanu said. His voice was soft. It wasn't weak, but it was quiet. The people in the back of the room leaned forward in their seats. The judge stopped writing and looked up over her glasses. Even the bailiff, who usually looked like he was half asleep, opened his eyes a little wider. I'm not a lawyer, Keanu began, and I'm not an expert in computer code. I can't tell you about the ones and zeros that make up the algorithm we're talking about. David smirked. He leaned over to Victoria and whispered, He's got nothing, no evidence. It's just a sob story waiting to happen. Victoria hushed him, her eyes fixed on Keanu. But I know what the machine does, Keanu continued. He looked at the jurors, one by one, making eye contact with them. I know what it feels like to be on a bike that is moving too fast. I know what it feels like when the tires lose grip on the road. It's a specific feeling. It's like the world drops out from under you. He moved his hands as he spoke, mimicking the motion of a handlebar turning. In that split second, you aren't thinking about patents. You aren't thinking about who owns what. You are thinking about the ground coming up to meet you. You are thinking about your legs. You are thinking about your spine. David shifted in his seat. He didn't like this. It wasn't fair. You couldn't argue in court using feelings. It was against the rules. We built this stabilizer, Keanu said, his voice getting a little stronger. Not because we wanted to make money. We built it because we wanted to stop the crunching sound. We wanted to stop the silence that comes after a bad crash. He looked down at his hand for a moment, then back up. The lawyers showed you charts today. They showed you numbers. But this machine isn't a number. It's a brake. It's a lifeline. It's a second chance when physics says you're out of chances. David felt a hot flash of anger. This was acting. It had to be. This man was a multimillionaire movie star. He knew how to manipulate an audience. He knew how to make people cry. David looked at the jury again. His heart sank. The jury wasn't looking bored anymore. They weren't looking at the judge. They were leaning forward, hanging on every word. One older woman in the front row had her hand over her mouth. A man in the back was nodding, but not in the way he nodded at Victoria. He was nodding in understanding. David couldn't stand it. He grabbed Victoria's arm. Object, he hissed. Object to the emotional appeal. It's irrelevant. It has nothing to do with the copyright infringement. Victoria gently pulled her arm away. She didn't look at David. She kept her eyes on the jury. Mr. Sterling, be quiet, she whispered. Look at them. What? David snapped. Look at them. If you object now, you look like a monster. He's talking about saving lives, and you want to complain about paperwork. David sat back, fuming. He felt trapped. He wanted to stand up and yell that this was a court of law, not a movie theater. He wanted to tell them that Keanu was just reading a script, but the heavy atmosphere in the room stopped him. Keanu kept talking. He didn't use big words. He described the mechanics of the device in simple terms. He talked about gyroscopes and sensors, but he talked about them like they were friends. He described how the little computer brain inside the bike realizes a rider is falling before the rider even knows it. It waits, Keanu said. It watches, and in that tiny fraction of a second, it pushes back. It fights gravity for you. It gives you time to get your feet down. It gives you time to breathe. He looked directly at David now. His gaze was intense but not angry. It was almost pleading. We didn't steal this idea, Keanu said softly. We lived it. Every person who worked on this project has a scar. Every person who worked on this project has lost a friend. We didn't take code from a file. We wrote it with our own experiences. David looked away. He stared at the carpet. He felt uncomfortable. A long time ago, before he was rich, before he was famous, he used to ride a bike. He remembered the wind in his face. He remembered the freedom. He also remembered the fear. He remembered a friend from college, a guy named Tom. Tom had crashed on a highway. David hadn't thought about Tom in 20 years. He pushed the memory down deep. He had built a company to escape the messy, painful parts of life. He had built a world of clean lines and perfect code. But here, in this room, Keanu was dragging the mess back into the light. The air conditioning hummed on, but the room didn't feel cold anymore. The data on the screen looked dry and lifeless compared to the words Keanu was speaking. The blue charts seemed to fade into the background. The only thing that mattered was a man standing in the suit, talking about gravity and survival. Keanu stopped speaking. He stood there for a moment, letting the silence return. But it wasn't the empty silence from before. It was a heavy, thoughtful silence. It was the silence of people thinking about things that matter more than money. I have nothing else to say, Keanu said simply. He walked back to his table and sat down next to his lawyer. He didn't look triumphant. He looked tired. David watched him. He wanted to hate him. He wanted to see a fraud. But all he saw was a man who had been through something David couldn't understand. The judge cleared her throat. The sound seemed to wake everyone up. Thank you, Mr. Reeves. That was illuminating. She looked down at her notes. The tension in the room shifted. It was no longer a battle of lawyers. It was something else. It was a collision of two different worlds. David's world of ownership and profit, and Keanu's world of pain and protection. Victoria looked at David. Her face was pale. That was better than I expected, she admitted quietly. We have our work cut out for us. David didn't answer. He tapped his pen on the table again. Asterisk, tap, 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 asterisk. But the rhythm was different now. It was slower. He was thinking about Tom. He was thinking about the physics of a crash. And for the first time, he wondered if he was fighting for the right thing. The anger was still there, burning in his stomach, but it was mixed with something else. Something he didn't recognize. He looked at the screen one last time. The charts were still there, projected in bright blue light. But they looked hollow. They looked like ghost stories compared to the real-life Keanu had just described. The trial had barely started, but David felt like he was already losing. Not the case, maybe, but something else. Something he couldn't quite name. The afternoon sun had moved across the sky, casting long, sharp shadows through the high windows. The fluorescent lights overhead didn't seem as bright as they had in the morning, but the air conditioning hummed with the same steady, monotonous drone. It was a sound that was starting to give David a headache. The mood in the room had shifted. It wasn't just a legal procedure anymore. It felt heavier, like the air was thicker. The charts and graphs that Victoria had presented so proudly earlier now sat forgotten on the screen. They looked cold and stiff, like a skeleton without a body. Victoria stood up again. She adjusted her jacket, smoothing the fabric with a sharp, aggressive motion. David knew that look. She was going for the kill. She smelled blood in the water, and she was ready to attack. She walked over to the witness stand where Keanu was sitting. She didn't look at him with respect. She looked at him like he was a bug she needed to squish. Mr. Reeves, Victoria started. Her voice was hard, like ice cracking on a puddle. You've given us a very nice speech today. You talked about feelings. You talked about saving lives. It was very moving. Truly. She paused, letting the sarcasm hang in the air. But let's talk about the facts, she continued. She picked up a stack of papers from her table and waved them in the air. These are the financial records for your foundation, the Arch Foundation. For the last 5 years, you have poured millions of dollars into it. Millions. She took a step closer to the stand. And what do you have to show for it? No product on the shelves. No profit. In fact, according to these documents, your foundation operates at a massive loss every single year. David watched Keanu closely. He expected the actor to get nervous. He expected him to stutter or look down in shame. Being called a failure with money was a huge insult to a man like David. He knew how the numbers looked. Red ink meant failure. Is it true, Victoria pressed, her voice rising, that this safety system is nothing more than a vanity project? Is this just something a wealthy celebrity does to feel good about himself? You build a toy, you call it charity, and you ignore the fact that you are losing money hand over fist because you don't understand the business you are trying to play in. The courtroom was silent. You could hear the sound of a pen rolling off a table and hitting the floor. Clink. The judge looked over her spectacles, waiting for an answer. Keanu didn't look at Victoria. He didn't look at the papers she was holding. He just sat there, perfectly still. He looked at his hands for a moment, turning them over as if he was checking for something. Then he looked up. His eyes were clear. There was no anger in them, just a deep, quiet sadness. Yes, Keanu said. His voice was soft, but it carried clearly to the back of the room. It is true. We operate at a loss. We have never made a profit. Not 1 cent. Victoria smiled. It was a small, tight smile. She thought she had won. She turned to the jury, spreading her hands out. A vanity project. Exactly as I said. But Keanu continued, cutting through a moment. Victoria turned back to him, annoyed. We aren't in the business of making money, Miss Victoria. Keanu said, we are in the business of saving legs. We are in the business of keeping fathers alive to go home to their daughters. He leaned forward slightly. You asked if this is a vanity project. Maybe it is. If trying to stop people from getting crushed on the highway is vanity, then yes, I am guilty. He looked around the room, his gaze landing on the jurors. You can measure profit in dollars. That is easy. You put it in a bank. But how do you measure the value of a helmet that stops a brain injury? How do you measure the value of a brace that keeps a young man from spending the rest of his life in a wheelchair? Keanu stood up. He didn't wait for the judge to tell him to sit. He stood with a quiet dignity that made Victoria take a step back. I don't know how to put that on a spreadsheet, Keanu said. I don't know the algorithm for a life saved. I only know that we have made gear safer. We have helped design technology that works when the rider panics. I don't have a patent on caring. You can't own that. You can't buy the heart behind the work. He stopped and looked directly at David. The eye contact was like a physical blow. David felt his breath hitch in his throat. Keanu wasn't looking at him as an enemy. He was looking at him with a kind of pity. It was unbearable. I'm not fighting for a paycheck, Mr. Sterling, Keanu said, his voice dropping to a near whisper that everyone could still hear. I have enough money. I don't need more. I'm fighting for the kid who buys his first bike with his summer savings. He doesn't have your resources. If he falls, he can't just write a check to fix himself. I'm fighting for him. David gripped the edge of the table. His knuckles turned white. He wanted to scream. He wanted to stand up and shout that he wasn't the bad guy. He was the innovator. He was the one who spent sleepless nights writing the code that made the machine work. Didn't that count for something? Didn't his hard work matter? But as he looked into Keanu's eyes, the shout died in his throat. A memory hit David suddenly. It was a memory he hadn't touched in decades. It was sharp and painful, like a piece of glass in his mind. He saw his brother. They were young, sitting on the front porch of the house they grew up in. His brother had a shiny new bike. He was grinning, his face full of that specific, unbreakable confidence that young men have. He had said, "Watch this, Dave. I'm going to jump that curb." David remembered the sound, the screech of tires on asphalt, the sickening thud of metal hitting the pavement. He remembered running, his feet heavy and clumsy. He remembered the sight of his brother, lying in the street, twisted and still. There was no technology to save him then. There was no algorithm to break the bike. He was just gone. David had built his first ability device the year after the funeral. He told himself it was about engineering. He told himself it was about the future of transportation. But sitting there, under the harsh lights, with Keanu Reeves looking at him with those soft, sad eyes, David realized the truth. He built it because he was angry. He built it because he wanted to control the chaos that took his brother. He wanted to own the physics that killed him. He thought owning the patent meant he owned the safety. He thought selling the device meant he was fixing the world. But Keanu was right. David was keeping the safety behind a paywall. He was selling the chance to survive. The anger drained out of David, leaving him feeling cold and hollow. His chest felt tight, like there was a heavy weight sitting on it. He looked at his lawyers. They were checking their phones, looking bored, waiting for the next break. They didn't care about the kid on the bike. They cared about the billable hours. David looked back at Keanu. The actor was still standing there, waiting for the next question, but Victoria had nothing to say. She stood there with her mouth slightly open, her papers forgotten in her hand. She realized she had lost the room. She had tried to paint a hero as a fool, and she had only made him look more like a saint. The judge cleared her throat, breaking the spell. "Ms. Victoria, do you have any further questions for the witness?" Victoria blinked. She looked at her papers, then at the jury, who were staring at her with undisguised disapproval. She shook her head slowly. "No, Your Honor. No further questions." "You may step down, Mr. Reeves," the judge said. Keanu nodded once. He buttoned his jacket and walked back to his seat. He didn't look like a winner. He didn't gloat. He just sat down and looked out the window at the city skyline. David sat frozen. The buzz of the air conditioning seemed louder than ever, drilling into his ears. He felt like a fraud. He had spent years building a wall of money and contract around himself, thinking it made him strong. But today, in this quiet room, a man with no charts and no profit margins had kicked that wall down with just a few simple words. He looked at his hands again. They were trembling, just a little. He quickly put them in his lap, hiding them. He felt a strange burning in his eyes, a stinging sensation that he hadn't felt in a very long time. He wasn't the billionaire in charge anymore. He was just a brother who missed someone he couldn't save. And for the first time, he didn't know if he could win this fight. He didn't even know if he wanted to. The sharp sound of the gavel cut through the heavy air, signaling a break in the proceedings. The judge stood up and disappeared through the door behind her desk. Immediately, the spell that had held the room together broke. People began to move. The silence was replaced by the shuffling of feet, the clicking of pens being capped, and the low murmur of whispered conversations. It was like a machine starting up again after a power outage. Reporters packed up their notepads and rushed out to the hallway to file their stories. The bailiff stepped aside to let people pass, looking bored as he checked his watch. David sat still for a moment. His hands were resting on the polished table, but he felt like they didn't belong to him. The adrenaline that had been fueling his anger all day had suddenly drained away, leaving him feeling exhausted and empty. He watched his team. Victoria was already on her phone, her voice low and sharp as she barked orders at someone on the other end. The junior lawyers were gathering their papers, looking relieved that the morning session was over. They didn't get it. None of them got it. They thought this was just another case. They thought it was about winning and losing, about billable hours and bonuses. David looked across the aisle. The defense table was much calmer. Keanu's lawyer was pouring water from a plastic pitcher into a paper cup. Keanu himself was standing up. He wasn't rushing. He wasn't on his phone. He was carefully placing a notebook into a worn leather satchel. The bag looked old, like it had been to 100 different cities and ridden on 1,000 different trains. It was scuffed at the corners. It looked nothing like the sleek, expensive briefcases David's team carried. There was no crowd around Keanu. No bodyguards, no assistants, no fans begging for autographs. He was just a man in a quiet room, packing his bag. David felt a strange pull in his chest. It was a feeling he hadn't felt in a long time. It wasn't ambition. It wasn't greed. It was curiosity. He stood up slowly. His legs felt stiff. "I'm going to the restroom," David mumbled to Victoria. She didn't even look up. She just waved a hand at him, dismissing him. David walked away from his table. He didn't go toward the exit, and he didn't go toward the restrooms. He found himself walking toward the defense table. The carpet muffled his footsteps, so he made no sound as he approached. Keanu was zipping up his bag when he sensed someone standing there. He turned around. He didn't look surprised. He didn't look defensive. He just looked at David with those same calm, dark eyes. Up close, David could see the lines on Keanu's face. They weren't bad lines. They were the kind of lines that come from smiling and from squinting into the sun. He looked real. He looked human. "You're a good speaker," David said. The words came out of his mouth before he realized he was going to say them. His voice sounded rough, like it hadn't been used in years. Keanu let go of the zipper. He straightened up. "Thank you," he said softly. "I just try to say what I mean. It's harder than it looks." David let out a short, breathy laugh. It wasn't a happy laugh, but it wasn't mocking either. "I know. I spend my whole life trying to say things that make people give me money. You just said things that made people feel something." Keanu tilted his head slightly. "Is that why you're suing us? For the money?" David looked away. He stared at a patch of sunlight on the floor. Dust motes were swirling in the light, dancing a chaotic dance. "I don't need the money," David admitted. It was the truth. He had more money than he could ever spend. "I have more money than I know what to do with." "Then why?" Keanu asked. There was no accusation in his voice, just a simple question. David felt a tightness in his throat. He thought about his brother. He thought about the bike crash that had happened so long ago. He had never told anyone why he started his company. The public story was about innovation and the future. The private story was about pain and guilt. "I lost my brother," David said, the words feeling heavy as they left his lips. "Years ago, a long time before I made my first $1 million. He looked back at Keanu. It was a motorcycle crash. He was young. He was faster than he should have been. He hit a patch of gravel and lost control. There was no technology to save him. No stabilizer. No smart braking. He just slid." David swallowed hard. "I told myself that if I built the right machine, if I created the right code, I could stop it from happening again. I thought if I owned the safety, if I controlled the technology, I could cheat death. I could win." He stopped, his voice trembling just a little. "I thought that by suing you, I was protecting that. I thought I was protecting the work that was supposed to save people like him." The room was very quiet now. The hum of the air conditioning seemed to fade into the background. The people in the hallway were just a distant noise. Keanu didn't look away. He didn't offer a polite, scripted condolence. He didn't say, "I'm sorry for your loss," in a way that meant nothing. He just stood there, absorbing the weight of what David had said. "You can't own the outcome, David," Keanu said gently. David blinked. "What?" "You can't own the outcome," Keanu repeated. He stepped a little closer. "You can build the best machine in the world. You can write the perfect code, but you can't control the road. You can't control the weather. You can't control the mistakes people make. You can't own safety. You can only try to help." Keanu gestured toward the door, toward the world outside. "We're on the same side. You just forgot why we're fighting. You're fighting against the past. I'm fighting for the future." David felt a crack form in the wall he had built around his heart for decades. He had spent so long being angry at the world for taking his brother that he had become the thing he hated. He had become a barrier. He was hoarding the very thing that could have saved his brother's life. He looked at Keanu's worn bag. He looked at Keanu's kind face. This man, who had also known terrible loss, wasn't trying to beat the system. He was trying to fix it. "I thought you were stealing from me," David whispered. "We weren't," Keanu said. "We were just trying to build a parachute." David took a deep breath. The air in the room didn't feel so sterile anymore. It felt cleaner. He felt lighter. The anger that had been burning a hole in his stomach all morning was gone. In its place was a strange sense of clarity. He looked at his own table, where Victoria was still arguing on the phone. He looked at the stacks of paper, the lawsuits, the greed. He realized then that he didn't want to be the villain in this story. He didn't want to be the rich man who sued the charity. He wanted to be the man who saved his brother. "Thank you," David said. It wasn't a polite thank you. It was deep and heartfelt. Keanu nodded once. "Anytime, David." David turned and walked away. He didn't go back to his table immediately. He walked toward the large windows. He looked out at the city. It was a chaotic mess of buildings and traffic. People were making mistakes down there. People were falling down. But there were also people getting back up. He couldn't save everyone. He couldn't own the outcome. But maybe, just maybe, he could help build a parachute. He stood there for a long time, watching the world move, while the quiet hum of the courtroom waited for the next act to begin. But David knew the play had changed. The script had been torn up, and for the first time in a long time, he was ready to write a new line. The bailiff's voice cut through the murmuring crowd, signaling that the break was over. "All rise. The Honorable Judge Holloway is returning." The sound of shuffling feet and rustling clothes filled the room as everyone stood up. The judge walked back to her high desk, sitting down with a heavy sigh. She adjusted her glasses and looked at her watch, clearly ready to get things moving. The air conditioning hummed, a constant reminder of the artificial environment they were all trapped in. Victoria, David's lawyer, immediately stood up. She straightened her blazer and grabbed a stack of documents. She was in attack mode. David could see it in the set of her shoulders. She was ready to tear apart the next witness, ready to poke holes in the defense's story. She was doing what she was paid to do. "Win. Your Honor," Victoria said, her voice ringing out clearly. "The plaintiff calls Mr. Thomas to the stand regarding the financial discrepancies we found in the foundations." "Stop," David said. The word wasn't loud, but in the quiet room, it sounded like a gunshot. Victoria froze. She turned slowly, looking at David with a mix of confusion and annoyance. The judge looked up, her eyebrows raised. The court reporter stopped typing. Every eye in the room turned to the plaintiff's table. David stood up. He felt his legs shaking slightly, but he forced them to be steady. He looked at Victoria and gently took the stack of papers out of her hands. He placed them face down on the table. "David," Victoria whispered harshly, "what are you doing? We have them right where we want them." "No," David said softly. "We don't." He turned away from her and walked toward the center of the room. He stood between his table and Keanu's table. He didn't look like a billionaire tycoon right then. He looked like a man who had finally woken up from a long, bad dream. He looked at the judge. "Your Honor," David began. His voice was a little shaky at first, but it grew stronger with every word. "I would like to withdraw the lawsuit." A gasp went through the courtroom. The reporters in the back started typing furiously on their laptops. The judge leaned forward, peering over her glasses. "Mr. Sterling," the judge said slowly, "is this some kind of joke? We are in the middle of a trial." "No, Your Honor," David said. He shook his head. "It's not a joke. It's a correction." He looked over at Keanu. The actor was sitting still, watching him with a calm expression. There was no look of victory on his face, just a quiet interest. "I realized something during the recess," David continued, addressing the court but speaking to Keanu. "I thought we were competing. I thought Mr. Reeves and his foundation were the enemy. I thought they were trying to steal what was mine." He paused, taking a deep breath. "But I was wrong. We aren't competitors. We are collaborators. We both want the same thing. We want people to be safe." I got so caught up in owning the idea that I forgot what the idea was actually for. The room was so quiet you could hear the air conditioner kicking in. The silence was heavy, but it wasn't oppressive anymore. It was full of anticipation. "I'm not just dropping the suit," David said, his voice echoing off the walls. "I'm assigning the patent rights to the Arch Foundation, effective immediately." This time, the silence shattered. Victoria let out a loud, "What?" and stood up, her face red. "Mr. Sterling, you cannot do that. That patent is worth billions. You are giving away the company's future assets." David turned to her. For the first time, he didn't see a fierce lawyer. He just saw a person who didn't understand. "It's not an asset, Victoria. It's a tool. and it belongs in the hands of people who know how to use it to save lives. He looked back at the judge. My company will provide the manufacturing resources at cost. No profit. We will build the machines, and the foundation will distribute them. We stop arguing about money and start saving people. The judge looked at David for a long moment. She was an old woman who had seen thousands of cases. She had seen greed, she had seen lies, and she had seen drama. But as she looked at David, she saw something genuine. She saw a man changing his own mind in real time. Mr. Reeves, the judge said, looking at the defense table, do you accept these terms? Keanu stood up. He didn't have a prepared speech. He didn't have lawyers whispering in his ear. He just buttoned his jacket and looked at David. Yes, Your Honor, Keanu said. A small, genuine smile appeared on his face. I accept, and I thank Mr. Sterling for his generosity of spirit. It's not generosity, David said quickly. It's just the right thing to do. The judge nodded once. She picked up her gavel but paused before hitting it. In 30 years on the bench, I have never seen a plaintiff turn a case upside down like this. But the court accepts the withdrawal. Case dismissed. She brought the gavel down. Bang. It was a simple sound, but it felt like the end of a war. The tension that had been squeezing the room all day vanished instantly. It didn't dissolve into a party atmosphere. It dissolved into a sense of peace. The reporters rushed out of the room, their phones already broadcasting the news. The bailiff opened the doors to let the public leave. But David didn't move right away. He stood there for a moment, letting the reality sink in. He had just given away billions of dollars in potential revenue. He had just made his board of directors furious. He had just broken every rule of business he had ever lived by, and he had never felt lighter. He gathered his things. Victoria was still sitting at the table, looking at him as if he had lost his mind. He didn't try to explain it to her. He knew she wouldn't understand. You couldn't explain a feeling of freedom to someone who was happy in their cage. David walked out of the courtroom. He didn't use the private exit for the VIPs. He walked out the main doors. The automatic glass sensors picked up his movement, and the doors slid open with a soft hiss. No heavy wooden doors slammed shut behind him. He stepped out into the afternoon. The sun was bright, almost blinding after the dim lighting of the court. The city noise rushed at him, horns honking, sirens wailing, people talking. It was chaotic and loud and beautiful. He stood on the top step of the courthouse, taking a deep breath of the air. It smelled like car exhaust and hot pavement, but to him, it smelled like a second chance. David. He turned. Keanu was standing a few feet away. He had his old leather bag slung over his shoulder. He wasn't surrounded by a crowd. He was just standing there, looking at the street. Keanu, David said. That was unexpected, Keanu said, walking over to him. I know, David replied. He leaned against the stone railing. My lawyers are going to kill me. My stock price might drop tomorrow. The internet is going to think I'm crazy. Does that matter? Keanu asked. David looked at the traffic moving down the street. He watched a young guy on a motorcycle weave through the cars. The guy was wearing a helmet, but he was going fast. No, David said. It doesn't matter. I kept thinking about my brother. I wanted to own the technology so I could be the hero. But the hero isn't the guy who owns the patent. The hero is the guy who makes sure the kid on that bike makes it home for dinner. Keanu nodded. He looked at the same biker. We're going to need a bigger factory if we want to put these stabilizers on every bike. David smiled. It was a real smile, one that reached his eyes. I have a really big factory, and the best engineers in the world. They're yours now. Well, ours. Keanu extended his hand. It was a simple gesture, but it meant everything. David took it. Keanu's grip was firm and warm. Welcome to the team, David, Keanu said. Thanks, David replied. I think I'm going to like it here. They stood there for a moment, two very different men watching the city go by. The sun was starting to dip lower in the sky, casting long, golden shadows across the buildings. I should go, Keanu said, releasing his hand. I have a meeting with some engineers tonight. We have a lot of work to do. Me too, David said. I have to fire some lawyers, probably, and then I have to get to work. Keanu chuckled softly. Take care of yourself, David. You too, Keanu. Keanu turned and walked down the stairs, blending into the crowd of people on the sidewalk. He didn't look back. He didn't need to. David stayed on the steps for a few more minutes. He reached into his pocket and pulled out his phone. The screen was lit up with notifications. Stock alerts, angry emails, news headlines about the surprise in the courtroom. He looked at the screen for a second. Then he pressed the power button. The screen went black. He put the phone back in his pocket. He didn't check his watch. He didn't check his emails. For the first time in 20 years, he wasn't worried about the numbers. He wasn't worried about the competition. He just looked at the road ahead, stretching out toward the horizon. It was a long road, full of twists and turns, and he didn't know exactly where it was going. But for the first time, he was ready for the ride.